Hi, everyone. I'm Lorraine O'Donnell, Research Associate with the Concordia University's Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network, QUESCREN, and Chair of the Forum Program Committee. Welcome back to the Education and Vitality Forum. It's an event of the Interlevel Educational Table, ILET, which is a QUESCREN committee. The forum is supported by the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. I'm pleased to introduce Session 7, the workshop on QUESCREN's education research briefs. I'll begin by stating that Concordia is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of the lands and waters on which we gather virtually today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous peoples within the Montreal community. And as I've mentioned before, we were really pleased and continue to be so to have strong Indigenous presence and content at our forum. Today's session is 1.5 hours long. It will be recorded. Please keep your mics on mute for now. If you have tech issues, please write a note in the chat and we'll help. Now, to introduce the workshop, we were pleased that Learn, the leading English education and resource network, accepted our request to prepare the workshop. Debbie Horrocks, director at Learn, and Emma Legault, assistant director, are leading it. Learn is a nonprofit education organization with a mandate to serve the English-speaking community of Quebec. Learn teaches educators and is clearly a good fit. What's more, Debbie and Emma contributed to the research briefs that are the topic of our workshop today. So a word about the briefs. They focus on priority issues within Quebec's English language education sector, and QUESCREN received funding from the Secretariat to create them. Why? Well, QUESCREN's mandate is to promote the understanding and vitality of English-speaking Quebec through various means, including research. And ILET's mission, in turn, is supporting Quebec's English language education system through various activities, also including research. Education provides English-speaking Quebecers with tools to survive and thrive. Its institutions are major employers for English speakers, and they serve as community hubs. In short, education is central to English-speaking Quebec vitality. As the briefs indicate, the English language education sector faces challenges. And as I mentioned in my forum opening remarks 2 days ago now, we can think of a spectrum with vulnerability at one end and vitality on the other. So the question is, how can education reduce vulnerability and promote vitality despite vulnerabilities within Quebec's English language education system itself? I hope you agree that the briefs effectively identify and explain important issues in the sector, and that they lay the groundwork for good discussion about key challenges and maybe some possible solutions in today's workshop. And I just wanted to mention the process for creating the briefs. QUESCREN research assistants Nadine Chamera and Angelica Restrepo surveyed and interviewed ILET members to identify education research priorities and the ideal format for reporting on them. They came up with a list and some possibilities and ran these by ILET, and on ILET's recommendation, we decided to prepare 2 types of reports. Some Excel documents listing resources and stats, and short research briefs with more stats and infographics, so the stats kind of coming to life. And it's the latter that we'll be looking at today. Nadine, along with Dr. Patricia Lamar of Université de Montréal, wrote, and may I say, rewrote the briefs. Angelica contributed early on as well. Nadine and Patricia also invited some guest authors, including Debbie and Emma. And finally, Patrick Donovan and I reviewed and edited all the documents before they were sent to the Secretariat for some feedback, which was very helpful. And then there was a final production phase. So ultimately, 8 briefs and 3 Excel documents were produced. So the process is not completely over. If you find errors of fact or dead links or other problems with the documents that you look at today, please send us an email. I'll put my email in the chat. And now it's my pleasure to hand the floor over to Debbie Horrocks and Emma Legault. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Emma, you're gonna want to put up the, there we go. There we go. Okay. So we want to get it, first of all, we want to get a handle on who's in our virtual room today. So in the chat, if you could put your name, which organization you're from, and your relationship to the education system and maybe where you're located, so your region. So if you could throw that into the chat, and we'll do that, we'll just keep on going. So the goals for today's sessions are really twofold. We want to showcase the data points that Emma and I have pulled out from the educational briefs. And then the purpose is to generate some discussions with you and with our special guests that'll surface some of the critical insights, maybe expand your understanding or our understanding, and maybe even find some possible solutions to some key challenges. So some lofty goals, but I think definitely doable. Okay, so first of all, yeah, so hopefully you've all had an opportunity to read them. I'm not going to take that for granted, but I do encourage you, haven't had that opportunity, I do encourage you to do that. If you're interested, the French versions of the briefs are now available on the QUESCREN website, and they were just uploaded this week. So for those of you who are interested in the French versions, they're now up there. In preparation for today's workshop, Emma and I reviewed the content of the 8 briefs and organized key data points around. We felt them into three themes. First theme is increasing vulnerability of the English-speaking community. Theme 2 is diversity, identity, and inclusion of English-speaking youth. And theme 3 is about innovations in English education, and that's really quite interesting. But before we begin, we have 5 guests with us today who are going to help us dig a little deeper into the 3 themes. They're going to share insights and experiences and answer any questions that may come up. And they're also going to participate in your breakout room discussions. So now I'm going to briefly ask our guests to introduce themselves. Maybe if we follow the list on the screen there, and tell us about yourself and your connection to the education or to the community sector. So we'll open it up with Cindy. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cindy Finn. I'm the Director General at the Lester B. Pearson School Board. We're a school board that runs from the edges of Verdun all the way to the Ontario border, and we're a school district of about 23,000 students. Our primary language of instruction is English, but we are a bilingual school board offering many services in French as well.
Tino?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tino Bornaro, and I am the chairperson of the Advisory Board on English Education. The mandate of the Advisory Board is to advise the Minister of Education on all matters affecting the educational services offered in our English elementary and secondary schools, as well as our adult and vocational education centers.
Alex.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Adrian, retired administrator from the Lester B. Pearson School Board. I'm the president of the Quebec Board of Black Educators, an organization which will be celebrating 50 years shortly. We were scheduled to do it in November, but because of the pandemic, we'll do it during the Black History Month. And our goal is to continue to foster a relationships with both of the English school boards on the island of Montreal, the Lester B. Pearson and the EMSP. And thank you for having me here as one of your panelists.
Great to have you, Alex. Kathleen.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kathleen. I'm actually originally from Ontario, but I currently work with Y4Y Quebec, which is a provincial nonprofit that focuses on addressing the various issues that English-speaking youth are facing across the province. The majority of the folks that get involved with our organization are post-secondary students, and I'm excited to share some of my insight from this role, but also having worked as an international recruitment officer at Bishop's University for 3 years, and how that might play into some of the shifts that we're seeing with young people outside of the province.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Patricia Lamar. She is one of the co-authors of the briefs. Patricia?
Well, good morning. I'm definitely one of the co-authors, but I would like to really underline that it was a team effort. There was a lot of people involved, including Debbie, Lorraine, Emma, that are here today. I teach at the University of Montreal, where I'm a specialist in bilingual ed, but I've been following the English official language minority sector for quite a few decades now as a researcher. So CLCs in particular and bilingual ed.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, well, I think without further ado, we're going to jump into theme one. So as you're going to see, what Debbie and I are going to do is we're going to briefly review some of the data points that we pulled according to the themes. Then we're going to ask some of our esteemed guests to respond to a couple of questions. There will also be a moment or two for breakout rooms where you'll have an opportunity to discuss yourself some of the challenges and ideas that are surfaced through the briefs. As well as ask your questions or just further the dialogue with our special guests. So the first theme, as Debbie mentioned, is around the increasing vulnerability of the English-speaking community. Certainly, I think the briefs very clearly captured some of the great challenges that our community is facing. So we pulled data from about 4 briefs. Obviously, as you might imagine, we won't be able to cover everything here, which is why it's so important. If you haven't read it already, please, we encourage you to do that. It's really quite insightful and I think quite useful for our work. So I won't read out all the names of the briefs, but you can see them listed here. I'm going to quickly bring your attention just to some of the salient data points. So as we know, enrollment just continues to decline. Right? This is a trend I think we are all very familiar with. I think what I'd like to add to this slide, which I think gives you some of the stats around it, is just some of the most salient factors that were surfaced in terms of why we continue to see this decline in enrollment. First of all, of course, we have to understand that across Canada, we have a decrease in the number of eligible students for schools. So that's part of it. But the other part for our community is large catchment areas. People are turned off by having to do long commutes to access the only English school in their region. That's a big barrier. A lot of it is driven by a concern for high quality French, as we know. So despite the fact that our schools and school boards actually have a very strong record for bilingualism, the reality is parents often perceive it as a risk. So in order to ensure that their children have access to high quality French, strong bilingualism, and to make it easier for them to integrate culturally, it often means that they will choose to send their eligible child to a French school. Of course, we know allophones and new immigrants do not have choice. They, of course, have to go to the Francophone system. The other reality is once those immigrants and allophones have gone through the French high school system, they are very likely to continue their post-secondary education in French as well. So there's just a few things I wanted to share with you. There are many challenges around resources and service delivery in our schools and in our communities. Particularly, we wanted to highlight the realities of schools in remote areas with isolated communities. They have very limited resources outside of the school period, let alone resources available to them in English, right? So as we can imagine, for those of us who live on the island of Montreal or in more urban centers, it can be challenging enough as it is, right, to find professionals and practitioners to work with in English. That is, exacerbated when you're situated within the region, as I think many of you, because I can see who's in the room, know quite intimately. It's your lived day-to-day reality. So that really does come through. The CLCs emerged as a potential solution. And I know I use the word solution loosely because I think it's not a solution, but it's certainly an asset. It's something that sometimes can help to bridge gaps because it places an emphasis on building up the connections between the schools and the service providers in the region. So that was something that was a little hopeful that we pulled out because of course it can't all be doom and gloom. Small school populations, of course, negatively impact funding. So as we know, as our numbers shrink in our schools, it leaves us more vulnerable to seeing school closures. It also means that we see less money trickle in and we see less services allotted to the school. And that is true from funding allocations within the education sector. It's equally true with funding allocations for the community. It can be very difficult for community organizations to prioritize services to English schools and communities when on paper, it doesn't give them the high numbers that they want to be able to report on. So that tension is sort of within our system and it extends to the community. Again, though, our system has done a few creative things. So we see some K-11 mergers so that we can retain our buildings. We also see some English language schools adopt a shared space with a French school. And again, that's one way that we've seen our system try and adjust and adapt and avoid, frankly, having to have an English school that is so far away or so inaccessible. Access to support services. So as we know, there's a lack of available English language speaking professionals. I think in our school system, it's true across the board, especially with speech language pathologists. Some common challenges to why that is of course, there are very rigid requirements around French proficiency testing. And the other reality is travel and costs. Sometimes reaching English speakers, especially in remote areas, there's not a lot of incentive for professionals to go out there and to meet that need. We also share a lot of our bilingual professionals with the Francophone system, and there really just isn't enough of them to go around to meet the needs.
And probably what I'll say right now is I think some of these points you're going to hear coming up under multiple themes. So you may hear a duplication of information, but it's because it's relevant to that particular theme. So continuing on, other challenges that the English school boards face include insufficient funding to support students with special needs. That's nothing new. And as needs increase, typically the funding doesn't keep pace. Between 2001 and 2016, English school boards experienced a 112% increase in students needing services. That's huge. We talk about the low socioeconomic status that many of our schools are communities that our schools are in. Currently on the island of Montreal, 32% of the English public elementary and 39% of the English public secondary schools are in neighborhoods that have a low socioeconomic status. Some researchers suggest that it's an indirect consequence of young English-speaking Quebecers leaving the province over the years to seek economic opportunities elsewhere. And then an additional consequence of this increase in schools in low socioeconomic status is that there's a large number of the English schools, therefore, are now eligible for additional financial support. Ensuring that English schools in the regions remain viable is always a challenge. Schools, Emma mentioned, are faced with rigid government funding parameters that really leave little to no wiggle room for them to adapt to the needs of the schools and communities. More and more Indigenous students are attending English schools, and school boards are starting to recognize the need to adapt the curriculum so that it's culturally relevant to them and ensure better cooperation and communication between schools and community organizations that support the health and well-being of these students. And then we look at the physical state of our school buildings. The data indicates that more than 30% of the buildings of our schools in Quebec are in serious need of upgrading, or actually considered to be subpar. I know the government has put some money towards that post-COVID or recently, but there's still a long way to go. When we look at students with special needs, 1 in 5 students in Quebec are identified as having special needs. That's 20% of the student population. And while Quebec's politique de l'adaptation scolaire requires the integration of special needs students into the regular classroom, the rate of integration has actually been significantly greater in the English sector, 88% versus 72%. But a higher integration rate doesn't necessarily mean a higher rate of student success for these students. As many schools, as we've heard, lack resources to adequately support them, be that classroom aides, psychologists, speech therapists, or social workers. The provision of services to students with special needs, especially assessment resources, has been a challenge for the English sector for years. Many parents give up waiting and just turn to the private sector to have those assessments done. And while enrollment in the English system has been on the decline for years, the number of students identified as having special needs has been increasing. But the identification process is a multi-step process, and there's often a delay in putting some of the services in place. And some children also go undiagnosed and unserviced for extended periods of time, which actually puts their academic success at risk. Many parents are turning to the private system for those assessments. Challenges is that some schools don't recognize those external assessments. Probably the greatest challenge that many schools face, especially those in the regions, is the ability to attract English-speaking professionals. And geography has something to do with it for sure. And the size of the population that need the services also. So smaller schools equals fewer students equals less access to qualified personnel to be available to support those students in English. And the government really doesn't offer many if any incentives to entice people to move to the regions. School boards are finding it difficult to attract these English-speaking professionals who have the capacity to meet the government's French language proficiency requirements to become members of a professional order in Quebec. Sometimes the government suggests a sharing of personnel between school boards, English and French school boards and service centers. And while on paper that might make sense, it's actually more challenging for the English sector, as often those professionals don't have the capacity to work adequately in English. Partnerships like the long-standing one that CLCs have with the Community Health and Social Services Network, or CHSSN, has contributed to improving access to English health and social services resources. More support is definitely needed for teachers in the classroom as the number of special needs students increase and more students show up to school with significant needs, but no accompanying assessment or services attached. And many regular teachers lack the necessary training to fully support those students. Teachers and parents have been requesting more resources and services for years, and it's likely why there's been a significant increase in the number of complaints about inadequate services for special needs students in the English system. It was at 4% in the year 2000, and it's now 30% up in 2018. Once again, CLCs are highlighted as an effective strategy to increase access to services for the English-speaking community through their focus on the development of partnerships in time of declining resources. However, on the other side of that, the CLC network continues to remain vulnerable, requiring stable, ongoing financial support through the Entente Canada-Quebec would be ideal to keep the network moving forward and growing.
So this concludes the data highlight portion for this first theme. And at this point in time, we wanted to ask Cindy and Tino to share their thoughts with us on a couple of questions. And Cindy, we're going to start with you. And we're going to ask, obviously when we get confronted with this data, it can sometimes feel a little weighted down. But as we know, schools and school boards are nothing if not creative. So I'm hoping you might be able to tell us some of the ways that you've seen schools and school boards navigate resource challenges.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Debbie. So I'll begin by saying I could talk about this for a very long time, but I know we want to cover all of the themes, so I'll keep my remarks brief. I'll focus on two things, two key words to remember about the way the English educational community works to meet these challenges. One thing is partnership, and the other thing is flexibility. So when we think about partnerships, there's very much truth in the adage, together everyone achieves more. So team, together everyone achieves more. Because we work together to allow us to pool the limited resources we have and to share strategies that work. So I'll just quickly give you some examples of that. So the first piece is the 9 English school boards in the province work fairly closely together. And we sometimes also work with the 3 special status boards, Cree, Littoral, and Kativik. So we do work, and we have a network of the directors general have a table. We're in an association. We have subcommittees. So we work across school boards. We share strategies. Sometimes we pool resources and try to act as a collective. We have organizations that exist like LCEQ, which is a leadership committee, Learn, which was mentioned and is you guys are from Learn, Emma and Debbie. So those are very important places where we can get resources or professional development so that we can continue to see the high success rates that we enjoy. And I think that's important to point out that Despite the challenges around the vulnerabilities, the English system consistently performs about 10 percentage points higher in terms of success rates when you look at the entire province of Quebec public network. So that's quite impressive. We also rely quite heavily on our Ministry of Education. We're fortunate that there is an assistant deputy minister who's tasked with looking after the Anglophone community. And there is also a department, the DSREA, which again, there are a number of people that help us navigate and make sure we use all of the resources that we have available. And then I'll say just quickly about other partnerships. We work a lot with the community. We try to work with our health and social service partners, but community groups, the YMCAs, QCGN, groups that are out there, we really do try to work side by side. And of course, one thing that distinguishes the English community quite a bit are the work we have and involvement of our parents. Our parents are very involved in our system, and that allows us to meet some of those challenges around resources. The second thing I'll say is just in terms of flexibility, we know we have to work differently. So you've referenced the CLCs. That's a great example of how we've tried to concentrate services in schools to be hubs that really meet the needs of all the community members, not just the students. But within the education system, we also work a little bit differently from our Francophone colleagues. So we use centers of excellence, this concept of helping meet the needs, especially those of our children with special needs. We have different ways of deploying the resources that do come from the Ministry of Education. And where those gaps fall short, we really do tap into the money from Heritage Canada for the Entente Canada Quebec, so that we can really address things like helping our students with mental health issues, training our resource teachers so they can better meet the needs, helping our administrators and teachers with induction and mentoring and coaching. And as was mentioned, we really do embrace this inclusive approach. So we need to make sure that all of our schools in Quebec have services, because the likelihood is many of our students are there in the regular classroom and need those supports to come directly to them in the classroom. So again, I would say between partnership and flexibility, those are some ways we manage and overcome in many instances some of those challenges around resources.
Thank you, Cindy. I appreciate the additional context. I know personally when I was reading this, it was sometimes a bit hard to digest. So I think it's important that we also remember that our community has proven itself to be quite resilient. So thank you for speaking to some of the ways how. Tino, we understand, of course, that Abby, the Advisory Board for English Education, is given the opportunity to flag these challenges and other challenges to decision makers at the ministry. To your knowledge, or from your perspective, what actions, if any, should be explored?
Thank you, and good morning once again. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this workshop. Indeed, the advisory board has flagged a number of concerns from the English community, which I will share with you. Some of my comments will echo what Cindy has already shared. Over the years, the advisory board has made many recommendations to several ministers of education regarding actions that should be taken. I will outline a few of the more recent ones here and now. These recommendations fall into three categories: enrollment, vitality, and of course, special needs will be addressed as well. Regarding the decline in enrollment, the advisory board has recommended that protecting the vitality of the English-speaking community must be a priority. And there are many ways to accomplish this, including governance, administration, provision of services, pedagogical, etc. Towards this end, first and foremost, access to English language schools must be extended and extended to immigrants from countries where English is a common language. That's one of the many recommendations that have been made. That is, Quebec should invoke Clause 59 in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Unfortunately, as far as we know, there is no political interest in extending access in this way. Also, French second language and immersion programs must be supported. This will ensure that parents with eligibility are less inclined to enroll their children in French schools. Maintaining high standards in both English and French, in the English and French language programs will render English schools more attractive options for these parents. A related matter is to maintain the vitality of Quebec's English language schools. The advisory board has recommended that local control of education must be maintained through a strong network of effective school boards. This is achieved by many bodies that support collaboration among school boards, such as, and as Cindy has mentioned, QUESBA, LCEQ, Dean, Proceed, Association of Directors General, Association of Administrators, and of course, Abby, to name but a few. English school board should be governed by a council that is democratically elected by its community. In other words, the stay or injunction on Bill 40 should be extended and extended indefinitely. This will ensure full community engagement in English education and will in turn preserve English schools' vitality. It is also recommended that funding should be equitable. In other words, funding should factor in the challenges that different school boards face. It also goes without saying that small boards have particular needs, that remote boards have different needs, and that these needs should be factored into any funding formula. In Indigenous communities, more control over curriculum and programs should be delegated to these communities. We all appreciate how important curriculum is, as it is sometimes considered the currency of schooling. To ensure that curriculum, as well as other important matters, is under the control of Quebec's Indigenous communities, governance of education should be increasingly the responsibility of our Indigenous communities. Small local schools, especially in remote communities, must remain open despite declining enrollments. This not only ensures that these schools remain accessible, it will also preserve the vitality of these communities. A full array of services must remain available in Quebec's small remote schools. Financial and practical support must be provided towards this end. Where this is not viable, then technologies must be available to provide these services remotely. Therefore, networking, including the use of communication technologies, is important, and these schools must have access to these technologies, including equipment, infrastructure, bandwidth, etc. Support for local initiatives to customize the curriculum should be provided. This ensures that the needs of local schools are met, especially in the remote regions. In other words, the one-size-fits-all is not an effective model. The production of local pedagogical materials in English schools should be supported. Restrictions on ministry-approved materials should be relaxed. This will ensure that the curriculum supports the local culture, will render materials more interesting for students, will improve student learning, as well as the vitality of the community.
Thank you, Tina. There's just about 1 minute remaining.
Okay, I'll wrap it up as quickly as possible. There must be access to adult and vocational education in English. Furthermore, school boards should have budgetary flexibility to meet the labor demands in their communities. Where this is not possible, then again, online programs must be supported. Funding to the CLCs should be maintained, if not increased. The allocation of funds from the Canada-Quebec Entente should be as transparent as possible. And last but not least, regarding students with special needs, policies and programs to support these students must be maintained, must be extended. We believe that this is very important as well. I rushed a little. I rushed it a little at the end, but I'm always accessible to elaborate, especially on any, and especially the last couple of points.
Thank you, Tino. And again, everybody, I would encourage you to really take the time to read the briefs, because within the briefs are more recommendations from Abby, right? Including things like policy level changes that they've recommended to the government. So if you're curious to learn more, definitely speak with Tino. Also, I'd encourage you to check out the briefs. We're going to move, thank you, to our second theme. And at risk of distracting you, I will also point out that there are some great comments in the chat from Deb Fulton, if folks are interested in hearing a little bit more of that regional perspective. Okay, so the second theme that we pulled from the briefs was around the diversity, identity, and inclusion of English speakers, particularly youth, but not exclusively. So we've pulled from, again, 4 different briefs. So the data we show you comes from 4 different places, and we're going to dive in. So as we know, I think all of us in the room already know this, an ongoing factor in the decline of English-speaking youth in Quebec is outmigration. Our youth leave. They get quality education. They often end up being quite bilingual, and then they leave. So unemployment and low income are some of the driving factors for this. English-speaking youth experience them at higher rates. And although they are more bilingual and more educated than ever before, they continue to earn less than their Francophone counterparts. And they also seem to have a hard time finding employment in their field. The other piece I'd like to highlight is, it's in the briefs, it's also in a lot of other research reports that have been released, which is around the lack of confidence, the lack of linguistic confidence that our bilingual youth experience, which tells us that even when they have a high degree of proficiency, they still don't always see or consider themselves to be bilingual enough to have a life, to build a life and a career in this province. The role of the ADM responsible for supporting English language education has been expanded to include Indigenous and cultural communities. As you can imagine, this risks further diluting the attention and the focus and support offered to the English-speaking community. One of the recommendations from Abby was that the ADM be allowed to sort of refocus their attention on the English-speaking community. Also coming out of the briefs is the reality that English community seems to have little influence on curriculum, which has mostly led to English education policy being a direct translation of French education policy. Debbie and I actually met with the QCGN briefly to get a better sense of, what was within our rights. And of course, I just want to say this out loud to everybody. It is within our rights to influence and make some changes to curriculum. So I'm just taking my opportunity to say that out loud. And, coupled with this, I would just like to point out, we have very little representation at the ministry. I think, I'm just going to read what it says on the slide. In 2020, there were only 25 Anglophones out of 1,335 ministry employees. And here's the reality that this is in some ways to me a bit exciting because of what is within our control, to influence. The reality is English speakers are highly bilingual, and particularly youth. They're our most bilingual segment of our population. The reality, though, as we know, English-speaking community is incredibly diverse, which means we have multiple linguistic, ethnic, and regional backgrounds, all of which form our identity. Most bilingual youth retain a sense of belonging to either the French or English-speaking communities of Quebec, regardless of a high level of competence in both languages. So that means that even when they speak English and French really well, they will still have a tendency to only identify themselves as having a sense of belonging to one community or the other. Begs some questions around, what is unique to Quebec, especially if you guys heard the keynote for this event and how Europe sort of looks at some of this stuff. It really does beg the question around the effects of politics here. And of course, over a third of students in the English language school sector do not have English as their mother tongue. And of course, that's something that we wrestle with all the time in our schools. It's a great asset as well as sometimes a great challenge in terms of the implications for cultural transmission and language development. Of course, composition of school teams has changed. So as our community invested in programming and personnel who could help our students to have strong French language skills, it also means that we're increasingly hiring French speakers and native Francophones to work within our schools. And while these professionals are very respectful of the Anglophone milieu, they are aware of differences between them. And the report suggests that they're not necessarily concerned with merging any gaps. It's also unclear from the reports if they're provided with much training in terms of what merging those gaps would look like. We have an increasing number of English-speaking families, as we talked about earlier, that send their children to a French language school. And Abby argues that schools should provide strong skills in biliteracy and biculturalism, which, certainly when you're looking at the demographic breakdown of our community would make a great deal of sense. But let's unpack that a little bit more with Alex. So, Alex, yeah. So we did want to get you, if you can, to expand a little bit on this concept. So within one of the briefs, Abby calls for English schools to promote biliteracy and biculturalism. What might bicultural or multicultural education look like in practice?
Thank you, Emma, for this question. Well, one of the things that came to me as I was reading the briefs, and in particular when we talk about the increasing level of bilingualism in the English schools and community, but we also see that it hasn't reflected into any sort of employability, something that we're very familiar with within the Black community, despite the many language issues or high degrees that have been obtained, it has not translated into an effective and employment. So what we're seeing from our perspective of being a minority within a minority is that I've always felt like language was not a real issue and was just used as a means to an end. The English community that I've experienced, they are a lot more bilingual. They are open to staying in Quebec. They are still, but it seems to me that although we propose biliteracy, biculturalism, although we see in the schools the different models of the English school system in terms of immersion or superior French, and what struck me in the brief was that how although some of these English-speaking students are highly fluent in French, they still don't feel they still don't feel that they're competent enough to be working in French, which is, I think it's a byproduct of really the feedback that they're getting, but it's not a respect to the reality. Although it's a strength of the English community to continue to want to live in Quebec, but what we see, despite the high level of French, despite the level of education, and although they have fully integrated and want to stay in Quebec, a lot of them are forced to leave because of that out-migration, which we see, which has impacted the English community. So personally, from my perspective, as a Francophone, first of all, my mother tongue is French, and I've always felt that even if my younger brother is a Francophone, although he went to school in English, he's been dying to come back in Quebec. He's not getting employed, although he keeps getting promoted in Toronto in the job that he does, working for CMHC. He wants to come back home and be closer to us, but it's just not opening. So I don't want to seem pessimist. Usually I'm a little bit more optimistic, but I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of, I think the English community is doing what it can. And this is a perfect example in terms of this forum where these themes have been discussed. I think until there's gonna be, as you've seen some of the brief, there's been a rise in the number of Francophone who want to attend English schools. There's a rise until that group really starts to effect a political will onto the system. We're just gonna see the same sort of roundabout and diversion from the political system, not to improve. I think about pour la commission des communautés anglaises and the way it's been diluted over the years, not to be respectful of the English, the present, and just the fact that some of the, and you can hear some of the narrative, the original Anglos or the historic Anglos, it just to show that despite what the English minority is doing, without all of those innovation that has been seen, we have not seen that translation into real effect. But I do believe that with time, as the Francophone, I think it's a Francophone that will make that shift. I think early on, Tino talked about what I've always felt.
1 minute left, Alex, okay? Sorry.
Pardon me?
There's just 1 minute left, Alex.
Okay, just want to say quickly, in spite of what, the recommendation that I've made for English-speaking immigrants that are coming from English countries to integrate the English system, this recommendation is not even looked at seriously. So in practice, I think the English community has proven itself to be fully integrated into Quebec society by all what they need to do. I think it's the other side now to sort of react and be a little more opening. I hope I was able to answer that question.
Thank you, Alice. Well, I actually think you might have gone off in a different direction, but still an interesting one. So I didn't stop you. So that said, when we go into breakout rooms, we'll come back to this question of, what does bicultural education look like in practice? Now, that said, it's a great seg to the question we have for Kathleen. So Kathleen is from Youth for Youth. And we know, of course, you work on these topics too, right? It's a challenge for your membership as well. So is there anything you might like to add, Kathleen, to our understanding of existing barriers to building a life and career here in the province from the perspective of youth?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think speaking as a millennial myself, I have some insights that could kind of highlight a specific part of that question, which is building a life. I think millennials, the trend in general for younger generations is actually pushing that entry into adulthood. And this is a trend that's been kind of accelerating over the years. We know that younger people are spending more time in school, first and foremost. They're getting their undergraduate, but in many cases, employment is actually looking for them to have more skills or more diversified education. So they stay in school longer. So they accumulate more debt. Younger generations have more debt than older. And so when they get to that point where they actually have to build a life, it's a really critical time in their life where they don't necessarily have as much flexibility to move around because they have less time to kind of implement those other aspects of adulthood, which are, buying a house, having kids, finding a couple, or going into a partnership. Those were traditionally the defining factors of what adulthood looked like and building a life. So when you look kind of at what young generations are facing right now in terms of education, they are highly educated, but they kind of have a lot more social pressure in some ways to figure things out really quickly. And unfortunately, there is some intergenerational differences between wage increases. So for example, wage increases and the cost of living are really just not aligning in some ways. So that puts an additional pressure on young people. Why I'm talking about these things is because young people across Canada are dealing with these. And although we do see a high out-migration of English speakers from Quebec, we also see the highest levels of migration in between provinces across the country right now. It's actually the highest it's been since 1991, and that's partially been accelerated because of the pandemic. And young people are looking for areas where they are finding meaningful employment, but also are in an environment that is conducive to the lifestyle that they want to have. So, excuse me, millennials and Gen Zs in particular are also known as being kind of the YOLO generations, the you only live once, and they're mobilized around finding things that kind of ignite fires in their soul. So they're more willing to pick up and leave whenever they need to find something that's more meaningful or gainful in their life. And because of that, there's just less stability in some sense in terms of what it was traditionally considered kind of that classic move or traditional move into adulthood. Younger generations also are more likely to work abroad, to go on a leap year, to take on long-term volunteer opportunities. And I think it's really important to keep these things in mind because as you were mentioning earlier, Emma, the young people coming out of Quebec are substantially more bilingual, right? So they are valued on the international platform in a different way than what Anglophones in the rest of the province would be. And coming from an Anglo-Ontarian myself, that linguistic insecurity resonates with me, even though I'm fully bilingual. And I know that I could get a higher paying job with more security in the rest of Canada, without a question, right? So there's all these kind of like underlying boiling factors that kind of push young people to seek stability or kind of just chase what's going to be easiest for them so that they can pay off their debts, so that they can get the ball rolling with the rest of their adulthood. And because of some of these other Okay, thanks. There's some of these other socioeconomic factors that are you know, just kind of conducive for young people to move in general. The last thing that I want to mention, and it was identified in the brief, was the kind of the population of international students and students from the rest of Canada. At McGill, that accounts for more than that's about 56% of the student population. At Concordia, it's approximately 30%. And at Bishop's, which is relatively small, it's also about 50% of the population. So we're looking at about 40,000 students, even like give or take, every year that are graduating that are from either international settings or the rest of Canada. And it's unclear what their full intentions are anyways of whether they planned on staying in the province. But that's a really high number of students that, you know, it's not really sure what their place is in the province if you haven't been able to establish your connections within the greater Francophone community.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think that's very complimentary information for all the things that we're talking about. It's almost like the other side of that coin, right?
Lots for the English education sector to be proud of. Innovation is about creating systemic change within the network, within our schools, and about promoting student learning and student success through innovative programming and changes in the way the schools function within Quebec society. In 5 of the 8 QUESCREN briefs, there are examples of such innovative practices, and I'm going to quickly highlight some of them, and then you're going to have the opportunity to add to that list. So in many schools in our rural and remote locations have really small populations, and fewer students often means fewer resources to support the students. But small schools is not something that's unique to the regions. There are also many small schools located in our urban centers. And it could be said that they're actually at greater risk of closure. But to keep this from happening, our English boards had to get creative. So across the English system, there are examples of schools sharing buildings with the local French school or creating the K-11 schools that help keep students together and in their communities as much as possible. Another challenge that many English schools face is access to adequate support services for students. We've heard this through both themes now. And an example would be sort of the availability of English-speaking speech-language professionals, or the lack thereof, I guess I should say. It's a challenge that many English school boards have faced for years. About 5 years ago, Learn successfully piloted a speech-language telepractice project that has since been adopted by the MEQ. Telepractice is an appealing and cost-effective alternative to on-site delivery model that most school boards use, because it addresses things like the lack of available personnel in that particular region to service the students, and also the costs related to traveling great distances between the schools, especially those schools in the regions. Another strategy was the NANS program, New Approaches, New Solutions. It was an intervention strategy that was introduced in the early 2000s, I believe it was the early 2000s, to support secondary schools in low socioeconomic areas, and really to help encourage students to stay in school. The Minister of Education at the time was Sylvain Simard, and he said it was the responsibility of all interested persons, students, teachers, professionals, parents, school administrators, and community members to foster student success. Another way that school boards have done this, and then the ministry has done another innovation, is our community learning centers. Now we've heard about it. It's certainly, they come up in a number of the briefs, but they were introduced in 2005 to be part of an overall strategy to foster the success of young people who will build tomorrow's communities in Quebec. They were talked about, the ministry talked about them being an investment in a better future for the entire community. Schools, especially those in the English sector, can no longer do it alone, we know. And so we have to work intersectorally. It just makes sense. So bringing schools and partners together to work on complementary goals. And CLC schools in many have become access points for many community organizations and service providers who offer programming and resources to students and families in the English-speaking community at large. In the regions, many local and government agencies have limited ability to provide services in English. And so the CLC has become that bridge between the school and those community agencies, bridging access to partners who can provide the services and resources that the schools are lacking. A perfect example of this would be our partner with the CHSSN, Community Health and Social Services Network, over the years. It's been a tremendous partnership in the area of health and well-being. Lastly, the new curriculum, when it was introduced more than 20 years ago, Quebec publishers weren't that interested in developing materials for the small English language school population. And so Learn was created, and it was a merge of 3 different organizations created to support the development of English resources and services for the English school boards. Every parent wants their child to be prepared to work and have a future in Quebec. No parent wants their kids to move away and, you know, and start life somewhere else. So the introduction of French immersion in the 1960s was a community-driven grassroots initiative focused on supporting the development of bilingualism in our young people. And today, students in the English system have access to a variety of French second language programs, including French immersion. Another way, and obviously important to many parents, is to increase bilingualism and encourage interactions between English and French schools. So such an example would be the Pelican program. It's a language exchange project that connects students from the English and French schools and helping them to familiarize each other with the culture of the other language group. Another innovative program is the 2-year Option Études Châteauguay program. It's with the Centre Service Scolaire des Grands Seigneuries and the New Frontier School Board. It really puts English, it brings grade 7 and 8 students together from the English and French schools to break down ethno-linguistic barriers and learn a second language through a common interest in sports and culture. We come back up to CLCs with their focus on developing school community partnerships. It really puts Quebec's English-speaking schools at the forefront of innovative models for schooling in a minority language setting. Again, I mentioned the partnership with Community Health and Social Services Network, working together to improve the overall health and well-being of our minority language youth by bringing additional resources and services right into the schools. In Quebec, many Indigenous students are educated in English language schools, and support's needed to make the curriculum more flexible and culturally relevant to them. It's another area where CLCs have been at the forefront of initiatives promoting greater recognition of Indigenous peoples in reconciliation. So we have about 15 minutes left, and we have 2 questions for our guests today. The first one's going to go to Cindy. English school boards are continually trying to improve services and attract and keep eligible students. We don't want to lose any more to the French and the private system. Are there any other innovative practices, Cindy, that maybe you could stand out for you or you could highlight that is contributing to attract students back to the English system?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Debbie, for that question. I think when we're looking at this issue, it's critical to look at a few of the important key stakeholders. So the first group obviously is we need to reach parents and students. And I can see many school boards have made great efforts to emphasize that bilingual nature of the offering. We keep saying we're English school boards, and I always say to people, English is our primary language of instruction, but we do so much more. And it's not even just French. Many of our schools offer other languages, and a lot of that has to do with program offerings. So we do see parents wanting to come into our systems because of things like the IB program, sport études, art études. So we need to have programs that are really attractive. Many parents say they want more French in the curriculum. And yet, you know, there's this push-pull because as students go through secondary, as they get a little closer to the cégep or college years, they also want to make sure they get into a cégep. And so some students will come out of French immersion to go into regular. So it's a very complicated issue. But I think we need to know more what our parents want and what our students want. One of the things that distinguishes the English School Board Network in Quebec is that we do something called the Our School Survey. So all of the 9 English boards survey students at least once, if not twice a year, to say, like, tell us about your wellness, tell us about your level of engagement, who's helping you, what do you think about school? And that student voice is really important. We at Lester B. Pearson, we have student commissioners who sit on our council. We have a student leadership committee. So we're tapping into ways that our students can see that they can have an impact on their network. So I think we have to recognize people have choices. The English community has the most choice out of everybody. We can go private, we can go public, we can go French, we can go English. And so we need for people to understand the great things we offer and then adapt as they tell us that's great, but what more can we do? So I think we have to do that. And then my last comment will be, we also have to think it's a bit of chicken and the egg, right? Parents and students will come if they know we have great programs, and who gives and delivers those programs? The teachers and the administrators and the professionals and everyone who works in the system. So we also have to make sure we tap into finding the very best talent that can educate our students. And we're facing stiff competition. People can go anywhere in this country and be a French immersion teacher. So we are doing a lot of training of teachers and professionals, but unfortunately they do leave. And that's come up in what was mentioned earlier in this session, but also hints of it throughout the last 3 days. And so we really need to focus on why living in Quebec is an amazing experience, why school boards and educational institutions have real potential to offer great working experiences and working environments. We're doing things like induction programs, making sure our teachers feel supported from day one. All of the 9 English boards are working on wellness initiatives to take care of our staff. That's become only more important since the pandemic, of course, but we'd started this work back in 2018, 2019. We need to take care of people, take care of our talent so that we have the best people in front of our students, inspiring our students. And then I think that will, again, reinforce that parents and students will choose to stay within our institutions or if they do leave, to come back. So those are just some of my thoughts about how we can focus on attracting and retaining people who are English rights holders.
Thanks, Cindy. And it's like anything else, it's an ongoing challenge. You have to continuously be at it, right? So, okay, so our last question for the day is for our guests, is for Patricia. We've learned, and the CLCs have been working with Patricia now for probably well over a decade. Probably right from the beginning of the initiative. And you've been involved in two of the two large-scale evaluations of the initiative. So why do you think in the QUESCREN briefs, why do you think the CLC approach comes up as an effective strategy in such a wide range of contexts?
Well, I think it answers what we've been hearing in the responses from the 4 previous guests, like the need for flexibility, creativity, and partnership. I think that is the secret recipe underneath the CLC schools. And I will go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. I did want to make a point that research from around the world tells us that community schools, schools that are anchored and open to their community, are stronger schools. But I think what we need to underline here in Quebec, it also means stronger communities. And I think that's a piece that needs to be said more loudly. A lot of us know this, but I think it really needs to get out there that a strong school is a strong community. This is all the more important for an official language minority. I think this is where some of the solutions that we see that are effective are responding to the realities of an official language minority, what the CLCs are doing. And it's also all the more important for small schools anywhere in the world, schools in remote and rural areas, schools with students that come from low income areas, so vulnerable populations. And we have lots of that in Quebec's official language minority, even though we're not always aware of it when we're here in Montreal. It is a reality, including here in Montreal. So community schools then, as an integral piece to vitality, is the theme for this conference, but I think it needs to be made really clear to all stakeholders what a CLC can do. And what makes a CLC effective, as I said, flexibility, partnership, creativity, answering all those things, something Tino brought up. And we're in a circular discourse because CLCs were designed to be not one size fits all. And that came up through the ABE, and it came up through the design of CLCs right from the beginning. But it is one of the major strengths. So why is it effective? We're not looking at one size fits all. There's flexibility and room for local solutions and local, becoming aware of local challenges and dealing with them. The second piece that makes CLCs effective is that it's an approach. And I think it took a little while for even the major players in CLCs to realize it was an approach and it wasn't a recipe. It was something. It wasn't a place, it wasn't a program, and it wasn't a set recipe. It was an approach, a way of thinking about things and doing things that links schools, communities, important partners like CHSSN, et cetera. And there's another piece right there, networking. Because it's an approach, when we think of the CLCs, we have to think of them as being part of the school, being really part of the fabric of the school, which means that the idea of CLC as something separate goes right out the window. The better the CLC, the better it's working, the CLC school, the less you can tease those two pieces apart. That's a sign of success for me. And so when we think of evaluating CLC schools, we're not evaluating CLCs anymore because we can't tease it out. It becomes impossible to tease out. What's the point? Why would we want to tease it out? So when we talk about the future of CLCs, I think there's again a little change in how we talk about it. The future of CLC schools, a CLC school approach is what we should be looking at, and CLC as something separate needs to go right out the window. And we've already done a lot of work in that direction. The factors for success, and tell me if I'm going over time. These are
One more minute.
Yeah,
Patricia.
this is critical. And I think we really need to pay attention, especially at the moment, having a community designated liaison person, a coordinator. They've got a different name, but the coordinator who links parents, communities, partners, and the PRT and the school team. Somebody who has that responsibility. It can't be neglected. If it's not there, things fall apart. The practices, the good things are going to fall apart. Absolutely have to hang on to that. And that's part of the key to success. We know the engagement of the educational leader, the school principal. It won't work without a good principal who's engaged. PRT, networking, somebody that oversees and holds it all together for the province, for the sector. We absolutely have to keep the PRT. And that brings me to the fourth factor for success, hanging on to funding. We can't let this erode because we didn't fight to keep the funding and make this a permanent piece of our official language minority sector. Examples I won't go into, we've heard them through, but there's so many examples of where it's been effective, including reconciliation with Indigenous people. Just coming to terms that actually we do have an Indigenous population in those schools, and actually bringing it up and paying attention to it. I think the CLC did good work there. That's one example. And knitting together lonely people in remote communities that weren't attached to the school anymore, elder people with younger generations, people that had things to offer and that were alone and not connected to the school. These are all strengths. I could keep going, but I think I'm going to just stop there. Intergenerational. And there's so many good examples, and you can write to me, and I'll pass it on to Emma and to you, Debbie, for good examples.
Super. Thanks, Patricia. It's yeah. I would agree with everything that you had said, but I'm a little biased in that.
Well, I've become a crusader for CLCs. I didn't start off that way. I was curious, but so I'm definitely a crusader.
We were going to move into breakout rooms, but we have no more time left. So I guess what I'm going to ask is maybe what we can have if there's any other, like, we'll just sort of throw those two questions out to all of you. If any of you have any other ideas or recommendations or other innovations in English education, how we might to further invest, what other kind of promising practice do we need to invest in? So if anybody has any last minute comments, please, instead of going into the breakout rooms, we'll sort of open the floor and just sort of, does anybody have anything? They have any questions or comments?
Yeah, we invite you to either answer one of these two questions, or if you have a question of your own, you're welcome to ask it. Brian, your hand is up.
Yes, as the former principal with Eastern Shores and the chairman of the Cultural Committee, and we're going back almost a decade. One thing we did is, with all the grants that were offered by ELAN and similar cultural organizations, I would think 100% of the outings were for English artists to come in and attend English plays and theaters. So, I mean, I think we're doing a wonderful job with French immersion, and it's great for the bilingualism, but I think we also have to examine bicultural aspect, and perhaps, you know, get the government to provide some funds to allow the students to go to see Quebecois culture, the, you know, stand-up comedians and the singers and the plays and the theaters in French. And I think that that would be a great atout for our system, if we are not only turning out bilingual students, but also students who are bicultural.
Thank you, Brian.
Cindy?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I think one of the nice unintended consequences, when it was mentioned earlier that more and more we're attracting, you know, Francophone teachers to come and teach in our French immersion programs, that has just not only improved the quality of the French, but it also makes it more relevant. And I would say many of our teachers now, because they're familiar with the Quebec art scene in French, they have access to things in a way that it's not anymore, oh, we'll just go watch or listen to French TV and you'll be fine. It's the teachers really connect the students. And I would say there's also been a lot of work done. The Quebec government does fund us for culture in the schools, and many of our teachers take advantage of that. Unfortunately, since the pandemic, we've been limited in terms of how many groups can come into schools or how many field trips we go on, but there definitely has been some good movement in that direction so that students can go and see a pièce de théâtre in French, or they can learn about French Quebec singers so that they get that cultural aspect, because that really is key to feeling a sense of belonging in this community. I agree with Brian 100%.
Thanks, Cindy. And we'll give the last word to Deb Fulton.
Oh, that might be a mistake. You know
Okay.
how I could talk. I just wanted to add, I'm going to add to what's already been said, but in terms of innovation in English education, I think we really downplay our creativity, and we don't toot our horn as much as we should. I think that a necessity has driven not only advancements in technology and working with technology, but you know, we have to look at learning in a very different way. And for many of our schools in the outlying areas, we've gone from, you know, trying to offer programs that would not necessarily exist for students, you know, who may have an interest, whether it be music or art or culture or something to that effect, and bridging that into some networking, not only across outside of our school board, but also within, so that the networking can help support internally one school that might be able to offer to another, or may be able to support activities or exchange and social networking and all of that. So we've really looked at the networking aspect as being not only a contributor to learning, but a lifeline in many cases, you know, and reaching those students that might be in a corner of the province by themselves in a classroom with maybe one other person or two other people, and helping them thrive to a much larger extent than they would be able to. And finally, we're extending into services as well. I think that at this point, if we didn't have access to online services, we would not be able to make our commitment to that. And that includes specialized services, whether it's speech language development or other specialties that sometimes we have to seek outside of our geography, and in some cases even other provinces if necessary. So providing services.
Thank you, Deb. I'm sorry to jump in.
Okay.
It is 11:30 and I don't want to keep everybody too much longer. But that said, I always love hearing what Deb Fulton has to say. I encourage you to scroll through the chat as well. She's also provided quite a few great insights. On behalf of Debbie and I, we just wanted to thank you all for joining us this morning on a Friday morning, no less. And we would like to thank QUESCREN and the ILET committee for producing these much needed reports. We can't thank you enough. I think our community needs data like this on an ongoing basis. It helps us to do the work that needs to be done. So a very sincere thank you to all of you and to our special guests for joining us and sharing their insights.
Yep, I will echo what Emma said. So thank you to everyone, and I wish you all a wonderful weekend. Thank you.